In the mid-1960s, Montreal was experiencing a period of intense ambition. The city wanted to establish itself as a global, modern metropolis, capable of competing in prestige with centers like New York, Paris, and London. It was within this context that the desire to host the 1976 Olympic Games emerged. For local politicians, the event was far more than sports. It was an international showcase, a catalyst for urban development, and a definitive symbol of Canadian progress. The Olympic Stadium project was born with this grand mission. It was not meant to be just a stadium, but an unprecedented architectural landmark. The choice of French architect Roger Taillibert reflected this ambition. Known for his futuristic and daring structures, Taillibert envisioned a stadium with curved forms, a monumental inclined tower, and an innovative retractable roof, something extremely rare and complex at the time. From the very beginning, however, warning signs were already present. The initial budget was relatively modest for a project of such magnitude, based on overly optimistic and unrealistic estimates. Moreover, key decisions were driven more by political and symbolic motivations than by solid technical and financial criteria. The stadium had to impress the world, no matter the cost. Another critical issue was the timeline. Montreal faced a rigid deadline. The Olympic Games had a fixed date and could not be postponed. This meant that any construction delay would have serious consequences. Even so, the project moved forward without in-depth feasibility studies, proper geological risk assessments, or detailed execution planning. The rush to demonstrate progress outweighed prudence. Amid this scenario, labor tensions also emerged. The construction sector in Canada, especially in Quebec, was heavily unionized. Strikes, work stoppages, and disputes between unions became frequent, further delaying the project and dramatically increasing costs. Each halted day meant millions more added to the final bill. If you're enjoying this analysis and want to understand how this project spiraled completely out of control, subscribe now to the Wrong Project channel and leave a comment sharing whether you believe major sporting events are still worth this level of public investment. Your opinion matters. By the end of this initial phase, the Olympic Stadium was already showing clear signs that something was wrong. The Olympic dream remained alive in official speeches, but behind the scenes, engineers, workers, and managers were beginning to realize that the project was turning into a financial and technical monster. What was supposed to be a symbol of national pride was quietly becoming one of the biggest problems in Montreal's modern history, and this was only the beginning. As construction of the Olympic Stadium progressed in the early 1970s, what already seemed like a risky project began to turn into a true administrative nightmare. The construction site became a chaotic environment, marked by constant labor conflicts, frequent design changes, and an almost complete lack of effective control over deadlines and costs. One of the main drivers of this chaos was Quebec's union landscape. The construction sector was dominated by extremely powerful unions, often involved in internal disputes and political conflicts. Sudden strikes, partial work stoppages, and even acts of sabotage became part of the project's routine. At times, hundreds of workers would simply leave the site, abandoning equipment and leaving unfinished structures exposed to the elements. These interruptions had a direct and devastating impact on the budget. Every delay required contract renegotiations, penalty payments, forced overtime, and the reorganization of entire teams. What had been planned to cost a few $100 million quickly escalated into unthinkable figures. Still, those in charge insisted on maintaining the Olympic schedule, ignoring the clear signs of financial collapse. Another serious issue was the constant modification of the original design. Roger Taillibert's vision, while visually striking, was extremely complex from an engineering standpoint. Many solutions simply did not work as expected in real-world conditions. This forced engineers to redesign entire sections during construction, a guaranteed recipe for cost overruns and delays in a project of this scale. The inclined tower, meant to be the stadium's defining icon, became a symbol of this loss of control. Its construction required unprecedented techniques, specialized materials, and continuous adjustments. Each correction increased costs and pushed deadlines further back. Even so, abandoning or simplifying the design was never seriously considered, as doing so would mean publicly admitting failure, something politically unacceptable at the time. Meanwhile, public opinion began to shift. Montreal's population watched costs rise month after month, while public services faced cuts and taxes increased. The promise that the Olympic Games would bring prosperity started to ring hollow in the face of an endless and ever more expensive construction site. As 1976 approached, the situation was alarming. The stadium was far from complete, the budget had been completely blown, and the city was trapped in a commitment it could no longer escape. The Olympic Stadium was no longer just a troubled project. It had become a growing symbol of mismanagement, political arrogance, and decisions made without accountability. And the worst was yet to come. When the year 1976 finally arrived, Montreal was under immense international pressure. The Olympic Games could not be postponed, and the entire world turned its attention to the city. However, behind optimistic marketing campaigns and confident official speeches, the reality was harsh. The Olympic Stadium was simply not ready. With only months left before the opening ceremony, significant portions of the structure were still unfinished. The famous retractable roof, one of the project's main promises, did not even exist. The inclined tower was far from complete, and many internal elements of the stadium were rushed to completion, often without proper testing. Quality and efficiency were no longer priorities. The sole objective was to make the venue functional enough to host the competitions. This race against time had serious consequences. Temporary solutions were adopted to hide structural flaws and visible delays. Some areas of the stadium were literally improvised, using temporary materials and unfinished finishes. While the international audience was largely unaware of the situation, engineers and technicians knew they were dealing with a problematic building from day one. During the Olympic Games, the stadium fulfilled its basic role, hosting ceremonies and sporting events. However, it did so at an astronomical cost. By that point, the original budget had been multiplied several times over, placing Montreal in an extremely fragile financial position. Every cheer from the stands came with a bill that would be paid by future generations. After the Games ended, what should have been a relief quickly turned into another problem. With the Olympic pressure gone, it became impossible to ignore the stadium's flaws. The roof, still non-existent, needed to be built. The tower required additional investment. Drainage, acoustics, and safety systems revealed serious deficiencies. Ironically, the stadium entered a new phase of construction immediately after hosting the world's biggest sporting event. Public perception shifted decisively during this period. The Olympic Stadium was no longer seen as an Olympic legacy, but as a burden. Canadian media began openly questioning the decisions that led to this outcome, and investigations into costs, contracts, and accountability gained momentum. The nickname that would soon emerge, the Big O, was already starting to make sense. The event that was meant to mark the project's peak instead exposed its weaknesses. The world saw a well-organized Olympics, but Montreal was left with the invisible scars of an unfinished, expensive, and structurally flawed stadium. From that moment on, the real challenge was no longer hosting the Games, but living with the consequences of one of the most poorly planned projects of the 20th century. After the 1976 Olympic Games ended, one of the Olympic Stadium's biggest problems became impossible to ignore: the retractable roof. It had been promoted as a revolutionary innovation, capable of turning the stadium into a multifunctional venue usable year-round, even during Canada's harsh winters. In practice, however, the roof became one of the clearest symbols of the project's technical failure. The original concept envisioned a massive synthetic fabric cover supported by cables connected to the inclined tower. This system was supposed to open and close automatically, protecting the stadium's interior from snow, rain, and strong winds. The problem was that this solution required a level of structural precision and engineering sophistication that simply did not exist at the time, especially given the enormous scale of the roof. Construction of the roof began years after the Olympics, under intense political pressure to fix the stadium. From the very first tests, problems emerged one after another. The fabric tore easily, the cables failed repeatedly, and the opening mechanism frequently jammed. Moderate winds were enough to render the system unusable, an unthinkable flaw in a city known for extreme weather conditions. On several occasions, pieces of the roof came loose and fell inside the stadium, creating real risks for spectators and workers. As a result, the venue was closed multiple times due to safety concerns. Each new incident required costly repairs, emergency inspections, and often the cancellation of scheduled events. The stadium, which was supposed to generate revenue, increasingly became a financial drain. Public frustration grew as more taxpayer money was poured into attempts to fix the problem. The roof was replaced, reinforced, and redesigned several times, always with the promise that the issue had finally been resolved. None of these solutions, however, worked satisfactorily. The Olympic Stadium gained international notoriety as an example of engineering that failed to deliver on its most basic promise. Beyond the financial impact, the retractable roof severely damaged the stadium's reputation. Event organizers began avoiding the venue, fearing last-minute cancellations and safety issues. Professional sports teams were reluctant to use it on a permanent basis. What was meant to be a flexible, modern space became synonymous with unpredictability and risk. The roof, once a symbol of innovation and boldness, ultimately represented the exact opposite, the disconnect between architectural ambition and technical reality. It became a bitter lesson about the dangers of relying on untested solutions in large-scale public projects. Once again, it was the public who paid the price. With the Olympic Games over and the stadium far from being a functional success, Montreal faced its heaviest consequence: debt. The Olympic Stadium was not just a technical or architectural problem, but a financial burden that lasted for generations. What had been presented as a strategic investment became one of the largest public debts in Canadian history. The stadium's final costs exceeded all initial projections by an absurd margin. Between delays, strikes, design changes, structural failures, and repeated attempts at correction, the total amount reached billions of dollars in today's values. For a city the size of Montreal, this represented a devastating impact on public finances. The provincial government had to create specific mechanisms to manage the massive financial hole left by the project. One of these mechanisms was the creation of special taxes dedicated exclusively to paying off the stadium's debt. Widely consumed products were subjected to additional levies, and for decades, citizens of Quebec paid for a project that few used and many resented. The stadium became a constant presence not only in the city's skyline, but also in the everyday expenses of the population. The psychological weight of this debt was also significant. The Olympic Stadium came to symbolize the public sector's inability to plan and execute large projects responsibly. Every new structural issue, every safety-related closure, and every additional injection of public funds reignited public outrage. The stadium ceased to be seen as a sports facility and became regarded as a historical mistake that could not be erased. During this period, countless proposals emerged to try to justify the investment. Ideas such as repurposing, privatization, partial demolition, and even selling the complex were discussed. However, none of these solutions proved simple or financially viable. The cost of demolishing the stadium was nearly as high as maintaining it, creating a paradoxical situation. Montreal was trapped with a structure it could neither abandon nor fully fix. Only in 2006, more than 30 years after the 1976 Olympic Games, was the Olympic Stadium's debt officially paid off. This milestone was not celebrated with pride, but with relief. For many citizens, the final payment marked the end of a painful chapter in the city's history, one defined by broken promises, wasted resources, and decisions made without long-term vision. By that point, the stadium had firmly secured its place in history, not as an Olympic legacy, but as a warning, a permanent reminder that large public works, when driven by political vanity rather than solid planning, can become financial traps that are almost impossible to escape. Even after decades of investment, repairs, and the final payment of its debt, the Olympic Stadium never managed to fulfill what is expected from a sports facility of its scale, continuous use, and urban relevance. Over the years, the stadium suffered from a chronic identity crisis, constantly changing roles, losing resident teams, and being frequently avoided by major event organizers. Initially, efforts were made to turn it into the permanent home of professional sports teams. The most notable example was the Montreal Expos of Major League Baseball. Although the stadium was adapted to host games, its poor acoustics, limited visibility, and unstable internal climate made the experience uncomfortable for both players and fans. The public never formed a strong connection with the venue, and the team eventually left the city. Other sports and events faced similar issues. Concerts, trade shows, and large gatherings were repeatedly threatened by technical failures, especially related to the roof and internal infrastructure. Last-minute cancellations became common, damaging the stadium's reputation as a reliable venue. As a result, producers and promoters increasingly chose smaller, more modern and more predictable arenas. Over time, long periods of inactivity became routine. The stadium remained closed for months, sometimes years, awaiting renovations, safety inspections, or political decisions about its future. This underuse further worsened the financial problem, a massive structure requiring constant maintenance while generating little to no proportional return. The surrounding area also reflected this gradual abandonment. The Olympic complex, which was supposed to drive urban development in the region, failed to create the expected vitality. Nearby areas stagnated, and the stadium came to be seen as a foreign body within the city, an isolated monument disconnected from Montreal's daily life. Public perception was clear. The Olympic Stadium no longer belonged to the present. It seemed trapped in the past, in an era of grand megaprojects that ignored real usage and the population's needs. For many citizens, the mere sight of the stadium evoked frustration rather than pride. It constantly reminded them of poor decisions whose consequences still cast shadows over public finances. This phase solidified the stadium's image as a classic white elephant, too large to ignore, too expensive to maintain, and too problematic to be fully utilized. The failure was no longer just financial or technical, but symbolic. The Olympic Stadium became a case study of how a project can physically survive while completely failing in its social and urban purpose. Faced with the impossibility of simply abandoning the Olympic Stadium, authorities and administrators spent years trying to reinvent the complex and find a new purpose for its existence. The core idea was simple. If the stadium could not be erased from the urban landscape, it needed to be redefined. In practice, however, every attempt ran into the same structural and financial problems that had followed the project since its inception. Numerous plans were proposed over the decades. Some advocated transforming the stadium into a large cultural center, while others suggested converting it into a multi-use space focused on trade shows, exhibitions, and corporate events. There were also more radical proposals, such as partial demolition of the structure or breaking the complex into smaller, more manageable units. All of these ideas, however, required new investments worth millions, something the public and governments were no longer willing to accept. The inclined tower, one of the stadium's most iconic elements, also became a recurring issue. Its maintenance required constant inspections and costly technical interventions. While visually striking, it did not generate revenue proportional to its maintenance costs. The architectural symbol continued to exist more due to political and cultural insistence than practical utility. At the same time, the stadium began to be used sporadically, mainly for special events and non-sporting activities. Exhibitions, religious gatherings, and occasional events helped justify its existence, but they were far from turning the venue into a vibrant, self-sustaining space. The Olympic Stadium functioned more as an occasional backdrop than as an active urban center. The weight of the past also made any rebranding extremely difficult. For Montreal's population, the stadium was already deeply associated with waste, mismanagement, and broken promises. Any announcement of revitalization was met with skepticism. The project's history spoke louder than any future plan, creating a psychological barrier that was hard to overcome. Even so, the complex never stopped being a topic of public debate. With every new study, report, or proposal, the Olympic Stadium returned to the center of discussions about urban planning, public spending, and political accountability. It became a recurring example in universities, conferences, and analyses of what can go wrong in state-funded megaprojects. This phase was not marked by dramatic visible collapses, but by continuous erosion. A slow, silent erosion that cemented the stadium as a permanent reminder of miscalculated decisions. No matter how many attempts at reinvention were made, the Olympic Stadium's past continued to shape its present and limit its future. Montreal's Olympic Stadium still stands today, but its true significance lies not in its physical structure, but in what it represents. More than a problematic stadium, it has become a global symbol of the risks associated with poorly planned megaprojects driven by political pressure and sustained by unrealistic promises. Its story is studied not as a success, but as a permanent warning. The first major lesson left by the stadium is the disconnect between ambition and technical capacity. The project pushed the limits of engineering without the necessary conditions to support such innovation. Untested solutions, inflexible deadlines, and overly complex designs for the reality of the time created an environment where failure was no longer a possibility, but an almost inevitable outcome. The second lesson involves governance and public accountability. The Olympic Stadium demonstrated what happens when billion-dollar decisions are made without sufficient transparency, rigorous oversight, or realistic contingency planning. For decades, the public was forced to bear the cost of mistakes made by decision-makers who, in many cases, never faced consequences proportional to their actions. Another crucial point is the myth of the Olympic legacy. Montreal believed that hosting the Games would automatically bring economic development and long-term benefits. The stadium proved that such a legacy is not guaranteed. Without a solid post-event usage plan, massive constructions can quickly turn into enormous liabilities. The brief glory of the event did not compensate for decades of maintenance, debt, and underuse. The Olympic Stadium also exposes a recurring issue in public works: the inability to admit mistakes. Instead of stopping, simplifying, or redesigning the project once problems became evident, authorities chose to persist, inject more money, and maintain the narrative of success. This persistence only deepened the financial damage and amplified the project's negative impact. Today, the stadium holds a definitive place in the history of so-called white elephants. It serves as a reference for urban planners, engineers, economists, and public administrators around the world. Whenever a city announces a project that is too grand, too expensive, or too rushed, Montreal is remembered as a cautionary example. In the end, the Olympic Stadium did not fail only as a construction. It failed as a promise, as a legacy, and as public policy. Its greatest contribution to the future may be precisely this: teaching, in a harsh and undeniable way, that planning, technical humility, and responsibility with public money are not details. They are the foundation of any project that truly aims to serve society. And that is exactly why Montreal's Olympic Stadium deserves its permanent place in the history of Wrong Project.